And moving on now to Gaza. The Rafah border crossing has now been open for 3 days, but today the traffic at the crossing is bilateral. An Egyptian border officer told AFP that a wave of injured Palestinians have been exiting the strip in ambulances and crossing into Egypt for treatment. All those who have crossed underwent security screenings, and the reopening of Rafah is a key but mostly symbolic step in the Israel-Hamas ceasefire, with only limited daily movements prohibited and still no exception for the transfer of goods. The UN are also facilitating with the transfers and reporting a healthy cooperation. Have a listen.
The limited reopening of the crossing allowed some patients and companions to exit directly into Egypt, while others transited through the Israeli-controlled Karim Abu Salam crossing. The World Health Organization tells us that the last medical evacuation through Rafah dates back to May of 2024.
So the UN are clearly involved in the operations at Rafah, but could this be a bigger problem? This morning, the IDF announced it located around 110 mortar shells hidden inside an UNRWA humanitarian aid bag. I'll say that once again, an UNRWA humanitarian aid bag was located by the IDF troops during an operation to dismantle terror infrastructure near the Yellow Line. You do not have to read between the lines to understand that these mortars and rockets have one destination only, and that is the homes of Israeli civilians. And a shocking development for Israelis, the NCAG, which is the Palestinian Technocratic Committee set up to manage post-war Gaza, has quietly changed its public image, replacing its original logo with one nearly identical to that of the Palestinian Authority. The NCAG has updated its social media today with a new emblem featuring the PA's signature golden eagle, with the only change being the committee's acronym on the shield instead of the word Palestine. The move is seen as a modest attempt to link the committee to the PA, despite Israeli efforts to keep the PA away from post-war Gaza. Israeli officials confirmed today that the new logo was not presented to Israel and will not be used in Gaza's governing body. Despite Prime Minister Netanyahu's opposition to any PA role in post-war Gaza, some representatives are already involved in operations at the Rafah crossing. And joining me now to discuss is our panel of experts. I am pleased to welcome Professor Gerald Steinberg of NGO Monitor and Brigadier General in the Reserves, Relik Shafir, a former Air Force Base commander. Thank you both so much for joining.
Thank you.
So, Gerald, I'd like to start with you and get your 2 cents on this report I have of the mortars being found inside UNRWA bags. They weren't just bags. They were humanitarian aid bags. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. This shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but I'd love to get your analysis of this report. Gerald, if you can hear us, we can't quite hear you. And we'd love to get your take on that report.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay. It's not a surprise if you've been following, and you have for the last 2.5 years, that the UN agencies have been very closely cooperating with or been used and exploited by the Hamas framework, and that's still continuing today. So what we have is I think 100 mortars and other pieces, other weapons. That highlights the importance, first of all, of disarming Hamas. That's the next phase, right? We've got all the hostages out. We have a ceasefire of sorts. Occasionally there are efforts by Hamas terrorists to attack Israeli forces, and there's an Israeli response. But Hamas is still very much overarmed or armed. They have not yet disarmed. And that gets back to the question about all these different layers of the Hamas peace plan, of the Trump peace plan, are supposed to do. There's a board of peace. Then there's the institution that you just talked about. There's also an international or interim security force that's supposed to be some sort of actively supervising the disarmament of Hamas, but nobody knows how it's going to work. One of the key aspects of this is the end of the UN agency and humanitarian aid framework, which allows things like burying or hiding massive amounts of weapons in humanitarian aid shipments. Not just UNRWA, an organization that should have never been created back in 1949, but should have certainly gone out of existence 10, 20, 50 years ago. Israel has said, we are not going to work with UNRWA, and many of their facilities have been closed off within Israel proper. This is an example of the type of inability or unwillingness of UNRWA, the United Nations agency, like UNICEF, like the what's called the Organization for Humanitarian Assistance, OCHA. All those frameworks are unwilling or unable to prevent their exploitation by Hamas for terrorist activities, weapons, smuggling, all of that. These all have to be addressed. They have to be addressed seriously and permanently, not just temporarily. And I just don't see the mechanism for doing that yet. So that's a reminder of how complicated this is. And yes, Steve Witkoff is talking about these issues. Jared Kushner is involved in this. There's a lot of discussion with the Israeli government. We have the Rafah crossing opening, which was a gesture primarily to the United States. Let's not fool ourselves. Mm-hmm. The issue of the logo and the Palestinian cynicism. We knew from the very beginning that there is no such thing as a technocratic committee among Palestinians. You're either part of Hamas or you're part of one of the Palestinian organizations in the PLO, and that's what PLO is basically the Palestinian Authority, which is basically the Fatah organization. So all these things come together, and they really have not started to being addressed yet.
Mm-hmm. And, you mentioned the Rafah border crossing, and Relik, I want to turn to you for that. I mean, the border crossing is open. It's been open. Surely this is a direct threat to Israel's security. Rafah has been a notorious hotspot for weapons smuggling. How is Israel monitoring the situation at this point in Rafah?
Well, there is an operative establishment there where Israel sees through video and checks the persons passing on their own, in the sense that taking their pictures and comparing it to databases to see who they are and if they're connected. And I think we could see this by the fact that out of about 30-something, only 20 were allowed in, which means that the rest have been associated with Hamas in one way or another. So there is a way to control this, but I would also add that the decisions on what happens in Gaza are taken in Kiryat Gat by the U.S. administrators there, rather than in the Kiryat in Tel Aviv, meaning that Israel has been sidelined as far as Gaza is concerned, with a lot of work with the United States, but they're the decision makers, and they will call the shots on what takes place. And concerning the UNRWA smuggling, obviously this is what the scanning is there for, and I guess we'll continue to see this kind of attempts to smuggle, whether they being blunt, such as the mortar shells, or on a softer cue, some chemicals that may help weapon systems being built inside Gaza. So this will continue to be a thorny issue on both crossings, to make sure that the minimum will pass through without Israeli surveillance being very scrutinizing what goes on.
So what you're saying is that Israeli presence, Israeli screenings would be at these border crossings, but not inside Gaza itself? That's out of the cards for us?
Probably so. As I said before, the U.S., be it Witkoff or Kushner or the commanders present in Kiryat Gat at this time, they're directed by the U.S. policy of what they want to see. That means that dismantling Hamas would be somewhat precarious, in the sense that the day after, all the Hamas, let's say, policemen will subdue themselves to the committee, which is actually a part of the PLO, and will call themselves the PLO police, but the same people and the same light weapons that are certainly not going to be gone at any time. So that kind of a transition is what I expect to take place, and Israel can file complaints, but not much more than, and put pressure, obviously, but that will go against the ideology that the United States is presenting through the 21 points in its plan.
Hmm. So, Gerald, I actually want to go back to you for this question because this, let's call it the internationalization of the post-war Gaza, Trump's board of peace. It's less Israel's problem now to deal with Gaza the day after and more an international, a global issue that many nations are involved in and working on, primarily the United States. But is it to Israel's benefit or not? I mean, it seems that organizations like UNRWA, who are they belong to the UN. It's also a global organization. It seems that whenever foreign, nations or foreign powers are brought into the Gaza Strip, they just get hijacked by Hamas or whoever, is saying that they're not Hamas, but really they are Hamas. They get a hold of these international organizations. So how do you see, Gerald, this internationalization of the Gaza Strip and trying to rebuild and reconstruct it, and especially to start Hamas? How do you see it playing out, and is it to Israel's benefit or disadvantage?
There are a lot of uncertainties. So I can present a couple of scenarios and talk about probabilities. I guess I take a slightly different take than Relik Shafir does on this. There is an international structure, I call it a theater, and you have all these different various levels and boards and lots of people and lots of movement. You have the former United Nations peace envoy, Mladenov, who is, he understands the region. He's one of the few UN officials, he's essentially a European diplomat, who understands the region. But he is working for this framework, and he has to go along with the American setting the framework. The interest, and you talked about that earlier with respect to Iran, the United States and Trump wants to have peace agreements. He doesn't want to see fighting. Trump wants to get the Nobel Peace Prize, or at least see that he deserves it and solves another problem. That also applies to Gaza. But I think there are also certain limitations on that. Israel controls more than half of the land of Gaza, and that's going to stay that way. And that gives Israel a great deal more power than, let's say, between the pullout of 2005 and October 7, 2023. Israel really does have a great deal of control. And Israel does say to the United States, maybe not, they don't say no. The United States says, we want the Rafah crossing open next week. Okay, it's open, but only for foot traffic. And in fact, only 12 people were allowed into Gaza on the first day that it was opening from Egypt because of the Israeli ability to control the movement. So it's a dance, there's theater in it, and it's going to continue to develop. I think to some degree, we don't really know what goes on in first of all, in the perceptions of the administration and of Mr. Witkoff and Kushner and others, but they do understand, I think, to some degree, and Israel certainly makes it clear, that security interests have to be tantamount. Those are primary. And as long as Hamas is not disarmed, and that's probably never going to happen, or if it does, it's only going to be by Israel, as long as these other institutions don't think that they are somewhere that they're actually not, that they think they've accomplished things, let's forget about part two, disarming Hamas. If they say that, I think there's going to be a great deal of friction, but I think that also that's an admission of failure. So I treat all these international layers, to a significant degree, also the Civil Military Coordination Center in Kiryat Gat, as more theater than substance. I'll add one more thing to this, and that is the short-term, long-term issue. One of the short-term milestones that the U.S. government has established in coordination with Israel is to create housing in that Rafah corner for, I think, 20,000, 22,000 people in Gaza. A whole, basically, a neighborhood built out of the rubble that's on the ground. And that's supposed to be a sort of a symbol and a magnet for the rest of the Palestinian population in Gaza, Palestinian Arab population, 1.5, 1.7 million, some people say 2 million, nobody really knows, to cooperate with the framework, whether it's Israeli, American, international, doesn't make any difference, and then they too will benefit from this new housing. I'm skeptical that's going to succeed. We've seen the history of failure after failure, the ideology, the religion of the political religion of destroying Israel, particularly under Hamas, but throughout the Palestinian society, is still the dominant factor. And if the incitement and the teaching of Palestinian children and the generation after generation of hate and incitement and terror doesn't end, all these technical processes were not going to make a difference. And I'm not sure, I question whether the American leadership understands that, And certainly the Europeans, if they understand it, they ignore it completely.
They probably don't understand it, which is why it's so, like you mentioned with Mladenov, it's very rare to find, diplomats and politicians who actually understand the Middle East. But thankfully, I have my panel of experts here who do. Said that the PA will simply not be involved or have any influence. So, Relik, what are Israel's options at this point to curb this phenomenon that has unfortunately, already begun? How do we combat this indoctrination adequately?
Well, your whole presentation is, it depends on what do you call Israeli interest. Because a lot of Israelis, like myself, have an interest in a Palestinian sub-state. And that is to allow the Palestinians to govern themselves without military power and rebuild the Palestinian entity or unity in a way, such as helping them improve their life in the West Bank and in Gaza. So in a way, for people like myself who think it's a blessing, if the PA will take control of Gaza and be able to overcome Hamas one way or another through a lot of aid, type of a Marshall Plan that we're seeing being prepared for Gaza. Remember, there are 2 million Israeli Palestinians, Arabs, living within Israel who were blended into Israeli society quite successfully, even if you take into account the fact that they are leveraged against by the, I would say, the Israeli administration. They're still part and parcel of the fabric of Israeli society. So the more we have this kind of a relationship, the more the chances, because neither the 2 million people in Gaza or the 2 point something million in the West Bank are going to go away. So the more we find ways to get them a better life with Israeli security control, the less they will have I would say, not just the potential, but the will to fight Israel. So it really depends on us. But unfortunately, the Europeans and the U.S. as well are seeing the ineptness of our forces to control the Jewish terrorism in the West Bank. So this is all part.
That's unfortunately a completely separate issue, which is there are many connections with Gaza and the West Bank. But
what I think the U.S.
Yes, but Relik, I'm so sorry. We do have to wrap up because we are out of time for this broadcast. It's going to cut us off in just 10 seconds. And I do want to take the time just to thank you both, Professor Gerald Steinberg and Relik Shafir, for giving your insights and analysis. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.